Thank you to everyone at Women's Health Loddon Mallee for organising this, and I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm on the Dja Dja Wurrung land of Quota Nation. The land that I was born on is Noongar land in southwest Western Australia, which is the land of Woggle, which created, according to Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, a lot of the escarpments and rivers and embankments in the Perth and the greater Perth southwest area. And there's been a lot of struggles that Noongar communities have had over the decades in protecting land rights at sacred places where the Woggle rested there. And although I'm not from this country, I acknowledge that from what I hear from Aboriginal people from a number of different areas is that there's still unfinished business to do around treaty, sovereignty, and what it means as a white European person to be occupying their land. So with that spirit, I want to pay all my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present and future, to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room here today. And while my focus is obviously going to be on men's violence against women, all of these social justice struggles around privilege and oppression are related. And the struggles with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have for recognition of their land as being true sovereign owners, not only traditional owners, is similar to the struggles that women and children have to be able to live freely and to enjoy the human rights which women and children should be able to go about enjoying without any fear of oppression from men. My name's Rodney. I'm from an organisation called No to Violence, and everything that I'm going to say over the next 25 minutes has been said before many times by women. There's probably not going to be a single new thing that I'm going to say, and I want to recognise that some men have joined in your struggle, the majority of you here are women, in trying to work towards the end of men's violence against women and children, obviously for decades and decades and decades. And some men are now joining that struggle, which obviously is really, really important. But it's something, of course, that we need to do very carefully and sensitively and not colonise the space that you've been working and activating on for so long. And so, with that recognition, really want to stress that there's probably very little new that I'm going to be saying over the next 20 or 25 minutes, but recognise it's important for men to say this, and not for men to be more recognised than women for saying it, but it is very important for us to take some leadership on this too. So you've obviously heard a lot before in the panel around what is men's violence against women, and from yesterday as well. And first-hand accounts, which is far more powerful than any sort of diagram I'm going to show now. But I just really, really briefly want to set a little bit of context for my discussion and talk on preventing men's violence against women and what may be some of the things that we need to keep in mind to get at the roots of this. And we can talk about different tactics of men's abuse and men's violence, whether that be sexual violence or family violence in the home. But a core to this is a struggle for dignity. That although as a family violence worker I've spent most of my time working with men who perpetrate violence, I have also done some work with victim survivors. And through this I've heard some of the most, to be honest, gut-wrenching, amazing, but gut-wrenching, awful stories about what women and children have needed to do to maintain some dignity in their life, despite his use of violence. Many of you have probably, or some of you have gone to workshops by Linda Coates, Alan Wades and others, and they draw the analogy of how women who are experiencing violence, to at least some extent, are almost in a situation where they're needing to go underground with so many of the things that they do. It's like living under a dictatorship, in a tyranny, where the perpetrator is hiding information from them, socially isolating, making them doubt themselves in a huge, huge way. And so women resist, as do an occupied people, and do amazing things to protect their children and keep some dignity. When we're looking at men's violence against women, these are the things that we're looking at. And it's not so much from our perspective a note of violence that women need to be empowered towards leading autonomous, free lives and dignity for themselves and their children. This is about us as men trying to help your struggle, our struggle, to stop men getting in the way of women doing this. Because women, probably don't need to be empowered in some ways. It's us men that need to get out of the way of violating women and children's human rights. It's us men that are taking the physical space, the space in public, the emotional space, doing all the talking, needing to be defensive, needing to set what's right and what's wrong. So the struggle to end men's violence against women, from our perspective, is a social justice struggle about how, as men, we can stop taking so much space and so much control and so much power that then makes it incredibly difficult for women to have an equal opportunity to enjoy your human rights. Recognising that women and children still struggle and do this anyway, even in the most horrific circumstances. And that there's a lot in it for us men. There's a lot in it for us men about changing the way that we look at ourselves as being men and the way that we relate and use our power. So I'm just going to briefly show you a pyramid around this theme of, well, how do we get down to the roots of men's violence against women, or at least our story about what the roots are of men's violence against women. And this presentation will end with some practical ideas about particularly what men can do, but not just men, but really want to set this context about the work. And obviously at the top of the pyramid, why we're all here is we want to prevent family violence and sexual assaults, deaths of children, women, and men. Last year there were 45 family violence deaths in Victoria. I think all of the deaths were caused by men. Some of them were men who were killed, a minority, but by other men. But we're obviously looking at men's violence and men's homicide against women and children. We want to prevent that. Underneath that are obviously the far greater numbers of women and children who are significantly affected by men's use of violence. We're talking right now at this moment, probably at least 1 million women in Australia at this very moment are affected by us men's use of violence against them. If you add children to that, we start to talk about millions. It's a huge, huge issue, which of course I don't need to convince you about. But underneath there, and we can debate whether we put this here or the next rung down, to prevent violence before it occurs, to try to change our ways of doing things so that the violence doesn't begin in the first place, there's a number of things which we believe and we need to address. And again, I'm saying nothing new here. I'm really talking a lot about what women have argued for decades and decades. And these are the last 4 layers of this pyramid. Obviously sexism, a big part of the conference, challenging sexism. How do we go about doing that? What does bystander intervention mean? What does interrupting sexist jokes mean, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And obviously across a lot of the workshops there's this theme of how do we challenge sexism? How do we challenge rape culture? The representations in the media which give an indirect condonement towards women's bodies being used by men, or the direct ways in which women's bodies are objectified through corporate advertising and in so many different ways. But I've included homophobia, transphobia and racism and disableism as well too. These are important things for us as a movement, for us as a social justice struggle to link in with. One of the reasons why men use violence against women is because men, as part of the dominant masculinities, strongly define themselves by who we're not. Still, even now in the 2010s, so much pressure for boys and young men to not be feminine, to not be gay, to not have a fluid gender identity. And this othering is a big part of what condones and allows the dehumanising. So homophobia is related to men's violence against women. It's the other. It's the boy saying, look, of course I'm not gay, I'm not a poof. It's the lack of space that there is in our society for people to experiment with fluid gender identities, for transgender folk, for people who are what is called not cisgendered, and that means that the biological sex that they've been given with is not how they want to see their gender at that point in time. They might be biologically in a male body, but not feel like that stereotypical traditional male. Disablism, we know that women with disabilities are twice as likely to experience violence against women. So there's that double oppression there of being a woman and also having to face disablism as well. We know that with, and I apologise for being political here and also don't apologise. We also know that with federal government policies, really of all major political parties, which impoverish single mums, men who use violence, some of them at least, are going to use that as an opportunity to further isolate their partners. If it's harder for her to be able to have some economic freedom that she as well as men deserve, if it's harder for her to leave, it's harder for her to have a decent life for her children, and if she faces a New Start allowance and attempt to live that and to be a mum on that, well, he's going to know that, and it makes it easier for him to isolate her and to use violence against her and to keep that control and power. So all of these things are connected here, and to prevent men's violence against women, yes, challenging sexism is absolutely vital, but there are some other struggles too that we're joined up with. We see in terms of the sexism that the representation of women's bodies is still so ripe in the media. This is mainstream advertising and recent. It's UK, but some of those images made it to Australian television. Recently, I'm only talking, I think, about 2 or 3 years back. What obviously does that say about how we still see attitudes towards women's bodies and what we think is okay? Now, I think a healthy, sane response to that is to be outraged. We have no room for that outrage. And I think part of ending men's violence against women is progressively through time trusting our instincts that this is not right. And it's not a case of morals. It's about being able to link this directly with violence, that the way in which as a society we objectify and dehumanise women is the exact same process that a perpetrator uses to use violence against his partner or former partner. It's the exact same process that he makes her invisible in that moment, doesn't think at all about her or her children's needs, just thinks about his own self-righteousness, that sense of entitlement. It's the same process. I think the comment before was made around this narrative about only some men use violence, and there's many good men out there that don't use violence. Well, that might be true, but most, maybe probably all of us men to some extent collude in this. All of us men probably aren't doing what we can do to take a stand against this, and by doing that, we are still creating that sort of culture which makes it easier then for the perpetrator to invisibilise and dehumanise those in his family or others that he's using violence against. Again in the UK, but still fairly relevant if we look at this laptop for a boy and a laptop for a girl. What messages does that provide? We're actually seeing an increase in gender role stereotyping in children around colour. There's been some research, I think published about 18 months ago, which shows that those colour differentiations between pink for girls and blue for boys is getting worse. And so if I go a layer down, and maybe this should be one up rather than one down, we look at the next bit, gender inequalities. And again, a huge focus of this conference and of efforts to prevent men's violence against women. again, I don't at all want to be party political, and I'm not here because here are both mainstream parties. Not much has changed over the last 30 years. And part of, I guess, like what Rosie was saying in a way, flipping the focus a bit from, women as victims to men as perpetrators. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to do an all men as bastards thing, please. I'm not trying to say that. But we talk a lot about minimum quotas for women. What should be the minimum quota for women in a cabinet? Well, as Bob Peace and undoubtedly a number of women have talked about, why don't we look at a maximum quota of men? Because that's naming the privilege. It's not so much about empowering individual women, it's perhaps more about us men getting out of the way, not taking up too much space. It's the same thing, having a maximum of 50% of men compared to a minimum of 50% of women, but it's naming the privilege and it's naming the entitlement. And here we go to the next bit. And one of the things that we're seeing in some violence against women initiatives in Victoria and elsewhere is an attempt to start getting at male entitlement and privilege, start trying to get at some of these roots. And there are so many different ways that we can look at this. Now you might ask, why have I put nappies and prams up on the screen? Well, if we take a situation of a heterosexual couple, 4 or 5 months out from birth for her, both working similar hours, maybe both working full time. Who's most likely to do the research and to start thinking about what form of modern cloth nappies will we need? Or to think about, this is from a Melbourneite, what pram are we going to buy that's actually going to fit on a tram rather than its wheels being too wide and not actually being able to get on there? It's going to be her most of the time. After birth, and yes, Birth as the Baby Makes 3 program really works on so hard in some areas in Melbourne. After birth, the gender role division of labour does tend to differentiate, partly because of the policies we still have in Australia. So the dad's more likely to remain working, mum's more likely to take some time off in heterosexual relationships. But then if mum chooses and wants to go back to work, even if she then works a similar amount of hours to him, there's that division of labour that still exists. She's still doing more of the housework at home. That's an invisible burden of responsibility that us men place on women. It's something which is not negotiated, not discussed. It's just something that's expected that women will do the community work and the child rearing. A US study of about 26,000 people looked at the amount of time spent by adult children in caring for their elderly parents. And it found that on average, adult daughters spent roughly about, and this statistic really, really surprised me, 12 hours a week caring for elderly parents, whereas adult sons spent only 5 hours. And it's very unlikely that he's got a 2.4 times busier life than what she has in other things. Again, it's something that women are just expected to do, and it's not negotiated. It's something that's just left for women. It's something that us men leave for women, and we don't necessarily make the conscious choice that we're going to leave this for her to do. It's part of our privilege. We just feel entitled to not do it. And that's to our cost as men, because we suffer when we don't have those opportunities or don't make those opportunities to care for the people we love. This is meant to be some sort of UK comedy about a man in a relationship couple session, and he's looking pretty bamboozled. And I'm going to ask, in heterosexual relationships, who is most likely to notice when something needs to be worked on in the relationship? Who's most likely to be keeping some sort of pulse or temperature of the relationship to know that, I'm drifting apart a bit, not communicating that well, not spending as much time together. They're understandably so focused on the children that we're not giving much time together for a couple. In heterosexual relationships, it's more likely to be her. And again, as men, we just leave it for her to do, and then we get dragged into needing to do something to improve the relationship in the 9th time that she's raised it with us. This is part of the male entitlement and privilege in which we're leaving things for women to do that as men we don't see as part of our domain. And part of preventing men's violence against women is looking at these masculinities. And that's the final bit, the violence supporting masculinities. The more that men care, the more that men spend time caring for our family members, for ourselves, for the earth, the more time that we spend emotionally attuned, the more time we take responsibility for relationships and for building bonds together, the less likely we're going to be using violence, the less likely we're going to be dehumanising women's bodies, the less likely we're going to be condoning sexist jokes, the more likely we're going to be trying to challenge gender inequity, not only so that we stop violating the human rights of women, but so that we can start to exist and be in more flexible masculinities. The more likely boys and young men stop making poofta jokes, the more likely they're going to work towards non-violence. And there are many ways in which we can do prevention projects that help to change these masculinities. If we look at the early learning and childcare industry in Australia, for example, 98% of employees are female, only 2% are males. In the UK, they have a campaign where the percentage is very similar to try to raise that percentage of males involved in the early learning and childcare industry to 10%. You know, it doesn't sound like a very ambitious goal, but still makes a big difference to how we define ourselves as men. Because at the bottom of this pyramid is that competition by men to be superior, that pecking order amongst men. Men use a lot of violence against other men as well as women. In fact, I think the statistics show that men use as much violence, if not more, against men as other women, and it's partly part of that superiority, the need to be superior, the need to feel okay because I'm not gay, because I'm not woman, because I've got this stereotypical view of a man, because I can feel big and strong and proud of myself, and because I can feel right and in charge and in control and not vulnerable. I can just increase the adjectives. It's a massive strain for men to have to live up to. And many boys and men don't. But when they don't, they push that under the carpet and they keep trying. And this is not the whole reason why men choose to use violence against women and children. It's not the whole reason behind the power and control and the male entitlement. A lot of it has got to do with the privilege that we as men get. It's got a lot to do with the way in which we're used to, as men, just focus on our own feelings. And when we're feeling jealous or upset or angry or bad or vulnerable, we have that privilege that then allows us to blame her, call ourselves being the victim, think it's her fault, and that entitlement to do whatever we want or whatever we think we need to stop her from making me feel jealous. It's that psychological sense of self-righteousness that comes from entitlement, and a more flexible masculinity won't stop all of that, but it will certainly go a fair way. So how the pyramid fits together. Men's violence against women, particularly family violence, but also sexual assault against women who the men may not know. It's about tactics. It's about deliberate control and power. It's the man who thinks that his partner's making me feel jealous because she's going up and talking to these other men, blaming her for the feeling of jealousy, tunnel visioning, starting to think it's not fair that I'm feeling jealous, she's doing this deliberately to me, she's doing this to get at me, I keep telling her not to talk to these other men, and then using a range of different tactics of violence to stop her from making him feel jealous. Checking up on a mobile phone, screaming at her so she's too afraid to speak to other men, maybe assaulting a man that she's walking up and talking to at a nightclub, screaming at her on the way home, making her too afraid to talk to other men. And of course, these are just maybe old high school friends. But this is violating her right to connectivity, it's violating her right to have friendships. But he doesn't focus on that. He just focuses on making himself feel better. You know, it's part of the entitlement. It's a range of different tactics. And in order for men to do that, to see her as not human, to see her needs as invisible, to just focus on his own discomfort, and to believe that he's got the right to do whatever it takes to stop her from making him feel bad, she needs to be dehumanised, objectified, almost like seen as the enemy in a warfare situation. It's almost like what's happening in his mind is what I imagine soldiers might need to do to kill in a combat situation. That's fed by rape culture. That's fed by our society that dehumanises women more generally. And it comes back to those areas of masculinity. Those areas of masculinity that reinforces dominating and controlling women and objectifying women. So in the last few minutes, just want to bring this together a bit about some suggestions about what this means. And so it's obviously really important for all of us, particularly men, to listen to the experiences of women and children. You know, we have amazing people like Rosie and many others, many others, who are really giving us men the opportunity in a range of different ways, not only through talks through this, but books, through our own lives, through people we know who are experiencing violence. You know, listening to those experiences and believing those experiences is really, really important, because unfortunately our societies, our cultures still try to find too many excuses to not believe her, too many excuses to see that this was not a case of a man murdering a woman. And we see that recent media in Brisbane, recent media in New South Wales, the focus being on the murderer as victim, as one of 5 victims or 2 victims in a murder-suicide. Mental health issues, etc., etc. And yes, they're all relevant. But ultimately, it's his act, his responsibility. Tuning our gender antenna, something that all men can do. Let's notice when we see sexism occurring. Let's actually look at ourselves when we might be benefiting from entitlement and privilege. How much time are we spending talking? How much space are we taking up in a bus? Over the last month, how much time did we spend thinking about what housework might need to be done that hasn't been done in a while? When's the last time we contributed to our child's social birthday calendar around the different birthdays of his friends and started to organise social trips? You know, there's numerous things that as men we can do to get out of the mould of being a very restricted masculinity. There's so many opportunities through the media in so many different ways and in so many different settings. Only a couple of minutes to go. Just in the gaming industry, for example, there are very brave women who are starting to speak up, very brave women, and experiencing quite significant consequences through threats, as we might know through the media. And there's some men who are trying to speak up. There's so many different ways of doing it. We can try to look at ways in which sexism is occurring. The Bystander Intervention, I'll go through this quite quickly, is not just around interrupting when we see violence occurring. It's not only around interrupting a sexist joke or comment or commenting upon that, as important as that is. It's about when we're at a party, it's 2 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 blokes are sitting down having a beer and 3 women are cleaning up in the kitchen. That's a bystander intervention opportunity as well too, for us as men to go and help and to also let the other men know the reason why we should be helping. And just finally, a couple of last things. We have a website, whatmencando.net, that explores some opportunities. And again, there's not a lot new here. There's lots of great work being done in local government and workplaces, such as Take a Stand locally here. In child maternal health care, through Baby Makes 3, through sport and recreation clubs. There's so much great stuff happening to look at sexism and gender inequities. This just points to a few things that men can do. And I guess the final comment that I will make particularly for us men who are stepping into this space to try to work with our sisters in the struggle to end men's violence against women and children, is to try not to be a Superman as we do it. We need to be accountable. We're going to stuff up. And when we stuff up, because of our privilege, we're blinded to the experience that women and children have. It's real opportunities for us not to take it personally and get lost in our own feelings and think, oh, we're so hopeless in doing this. We're going to stuff up. We're going to make mistakes. It's just a way of, in a matter-of-fact way, being able to point that out to colleagues. Of opening ourselves up for scrutiny. Sometimes it can be harder for women to come up to a man who's doing this work and saying, Rodney, I actually felt uncomfortable when you said that, because there could be a fear of, oh, he's such a good man for doing this work and we don't want to lose these few men who are doing this. We've just got to do this in an ordinary way and make it easier for people to comment upon what we're doing. We need to be careful when we're doing events that we don't just, a bit like I've done actually, swan in, talk, and women do all the organising behind the scenes. We need to make sure that we're living the talk in that way as well, and obviously reflect on our own use of power and privilege. So I want to really thank you for the opportunity to talk and to share, I guess, some of these thoughts around preventing men's violence against women, but to really stress there's nothing new in any of this. I think what we're seeing, and I think as Rosie was saying, there's a different energy. We've got opportunities now. There's been a lot of hard work done over the last 10 years to make primary prevention a real possibility in this state in Australia. I think the next 2 or 3 years could be really fabulous. For us men who are here, let's sensitively, carefully but enthusiastically join in the struggle. Okay, thank you.